happy to see you.
Oh, yeah, we're recording this. Sorry.
Apparently we're recording. I'm happy to stand next to you.
Perfect.
It's my pleasure. My name is A.B. Huber, and I'm the Director of Undergraduate Studies and a professor here in the Department of Race, Colonialism, and Studies. My colleague, Courtney Sato, and I are honored to be co-chairs of this quite extraordinary work, the title of which is Transnational Infrastructures of Anti-Colonialism, Empire and Insurgencies Across the US, Britain, and India, 1900 to 1920. And if that sounds like breadth and depth, and like deep care for this history and our current conditions, then you've heard something right already. Nikhil Vootkur will be giving us a few comments to sort of open our conversation today. Welcome. And Nikhil will speak for something about 20 minutes, just trying to give some sense of the breadth of the project and to linger on a couple of details perhaps along the way. Then Professor Sato and I will have a slightly formal moment. We'll ask you to stay with us for that. We'll ask some substantive questions about the work, and then pretty quickly we'll open it to you all for questions. So by 11:45, you all will be invited in, and any kinds of questions are most welcome. It's a relatively abbreviated form, so by a little bit after 11, we'll start closing it down and celebrating together. But it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Nikhil and his work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. This is just so, I don't know, I feel so great. I've been calling it a bit of a victory lap, and that's what it feels like. I want to thank my professors who are in attendance, Professor Hatcher, Professor White, obviously my readers. Your coursework has been so critical to this project and to others, to family and friends who are in attendance, both here and on Zoom. Thank you for coming. And my friend Jordan's on Zoom, and it's her birthday, so happy birthday, Jordan. And of course, again, to my advisors, professors and readers, Courtney Sato and A.B. Huber, for leaving an indelible impression on my thinking and scholarship. Yes, of course, in this thesis, but also throughout my entire undergraduate career. Both of them have continually taught me and reminded me why this critical labor is worthwhile, energizing, and urgent, and for that, I am tremendously grateful. This project has been both scholarly and personal for me, and I'm thrilled to present to you today my senior honors thesis titled Transnational Infrastructures of Anti-Colonialism and Colonialism, Empire and Insurgency Across the US, Britain, and India, circa 1900 to 1920. My thesis explores the co-constituted infrastructures of Anglo-American imperialism and the radical relational responses that emerged in resistance, particularly through the Ghadar Party, which was a group of Indian emigres in the US who sought to free India from British occupation. There we go. As is the case with most good things, this thesis came to me as a happy accident. In the summer of 2023, I got to work for Professor Sato as a research assistant. And during a visit for her at the National Archives, I stumbled upon a 1917 letter from within the US State Department, which advocated for the repression of South Asian immigration into the US. And on the other side, I also found a series of petitions about the deportation of South Asian Americans who resisted America's alleged support of British occupation in India. Not having yet read Seema Sohi's seminal work, Echoes of Mutiny, these documents first exposed to me the US's role in Indian occupation, and they would later form the shape of my thesis. Almost immediately, far before I read or wrote anything, the title came to me. These parallel motions emerged as parallel infrastructures, which operated both transnationally and in opposing directions. Thinking spatially and visually, I imagine these infrastructures, as I call them, as bridges which span across continents. In one direction, imperial traffic is composed of American and British artilleries, upholding colonial occupation in India and elsewhere. In the other direction, South Asian anti-colonial actors, again, chiefly those in the Ghadar Party, and radical American labor activists transported pamphlets, literature, anti-colonial and anti-capitalist ideologies, and yes, at times arms. I imagine these bridges as vertically overlapping, with the colonial infrastructure casting a domineering shadow over the anti-colonial one. And in this thesis, I propose that it was under that shadow and its optic that Ghadarites and other radicals would clandestinely organize against the nation state, the colony, imperialism, and capitalism. Beyond a visio-spatial rubric, then, the language of infrastructure resonates with me because it invites the critique of the means by which British and American forces maintained and at times disavowed their global hegemony, and simultaneously how stateless radical actors worked against this inter-imperial regime in non-institutional ways. Embedded here are logics of political asymmetry and themes of intimate co-constitution. This thesis intervenes in conversations across South Asian studies, Asian American studies, and American studies to trace what I call the transnational infrastructures of anti-colonialism and colonialism. It is therefore not only a historical project, but a theoretical one, examining how empire is co-produced across national borders and how insurgent actors forge new relational and ideological terrains beneath its shadow. For this thesis, I'm most animated by three overarching questions. First, how do empires such as the US's or Britain's collaborate to reassert and reproduce their global hegemony? How do these inter-imperial formations thwart anti-colonial threats through surveillance, discipline, and juridical theatrics? And finally, how have anti-colonial activities historically manifested to counter these regimes? In addressing these inquiries, I turn frequently to Lisa Lowe's theoretical framing from her monograph, The Intimacies of Four Continents, in which Lowe identifies the Western liberal project as one that is intimately reliant upon the maintenance of colonial occupation and exploitation of colonized peoples to uphold the ostensibly free conditions of modern liberalism. In other words, freedom here at the expense of despotism elsewhere. And so my thesis is scaffolded as follows. My first chapter engages the archive and ideological critique. It locates the Ghadir Party within Anglo-American surveillance regimes and frames the 1917 Hindu-German conspiracy trial in San Francisco not merely as a legal prosecution, but rather as a performance of imperial intimacy. Drawing from both Lisa Lowe and Louis Althusser, the chapter reframes conspiracy as a discursive technology that enabled empire to obscure its own transnational operations and intimacies to reinterpolate anti-colonial actors as threats to global liberal order. By reading internal US correspondences, in this chapter I close read the archive, I argue that the Anglo-American inter-imperial regime relied on juridical flexibility, migratory restrictions, and ideological containment to discipline stateless revolutionaries like Ghadir members, whose counter-ideological illegibility disrupted the logics of colonial governance. I call these imperial conspiracies transnational infrastructures of colonialism. My second chapter engages both textual analysis and an intellectual history. It focuses on Hardayal, who is a founding Ghadirite and a polymath, as an ideological architect and fugitive figure whose embodied and epistemic mobilities exemplify what I call a transnational infrastructure of refusal. Tracing his archival absence from the 1917 trial, this chapter examines how Dayal's refusal of legibility through his movement, counter-ethical writings, and spiritual political visions unsettled the imperial optic. His later articulation of a, quote, world state in his 1934 Hints for Self-Culture offers for us a speculative cosmology and spatiotemporality in which sovereignty is embodied, relational, and agnostic to nation-state logics. Through analyses of Dayal's work and life, I argue that refusal emerges not simply as negation, but rather as an affirmative, ethical, and imaginative reorientation that lives in the present and reaches towards a world not yet here. In my presentation today, I'll be focusing chiefly on my third chapter, however, which is titled Transnational Infrastructures of Solidarity, which, in attending to the Ghadir Party, the Wobblies, and a series of petitions I found in the archive, engages a relational historiography and a comparative carceral analysis to discuss the coalitional, radical politics under the concentric shadows of Anglo-American empire. I will outline the first four sections of the chapter. This is the table of contents, which will discuss first the formation of ideological affinities and shared desires between the industrial workers of the world, otherwise known as Wobblies, and those in the Ghadir Party, including Hardayal. It'll second look at their shared struggles and their shared repressions. Third, it'll look at moments of solidarity that emerged from liberal, non-radical groups. And finally, it'll look at this idea of fugitive infrastructures and counter-intimacies that emerged after the conspiracy and sedition trials of Ghadir and Wobblies alike. This chapter begins with a simple premise, that solidarity between Ghadirites and Wobblies did not emerge from formal alliances, but rather from a shared refusal to be legible to the state. And again, I call these formations transnational infrastructures of solidarity. They are not necessarily institutional or territorial, but they're rather relational, affective, and insurgent structures that operated beneath and against the logics of empire. As I argue in chapter 2, Hardayal imagines a borderless world state in his hints for self-culture. His thought was not rooted in nationalism, but rather in ethical relation. And I propose that this framework, which again refused the border, created a rupture from which Ghadir could open up to coalitions whose ideologies extended beyond mere Indian liberation. Indeed, he and others in the Ghadir party worked alongside internationalist labor radicals, especially those in the Wobblies. Many, including Dayal, Kanokje, and Thind, who were all chief Ghadirites, held joint membership in both the Ghadir party and in the Wobblies. In fact, Dayal spoke at Wobblies events very often, and he served as secretary of a branch in Oakland, which was a major hub for the Wobblies. So he had a very big role here. They had other parallels too in practice and form. Both Ghadir and the Wobblies circulated radical literatures, relied on clandestine pedagogies, and shared syndicalist, anti-capitalist, and anti-racist commitments. These were solidarities formed not in the language of rights per se, but rather in the intimacies of shared negation, desire, and struggle. I propose that this lens of shared struggle, desire, etc., reframes Ghadir not as a nationalist prelude to Indian independence, but as a part of a global fugitive left, redefining in the process how we write anti-colonial, labor, and other subaltern insurgent histories together. And here, intimacy or solidarity emerges a critical lens for scholarly practice and seeing these issues as imbricated. And so I propose here that the state recognized this convergence, and in kind, they feared it. Both groups were therefore criminalized in parallel, using the same modes of conspiracy and sedition laws alongside tools like immigration exclusion and vagrancy codes. These spectacular juridical performances, as I further underscore in my first chapter about the Ghadir party, was about protecting the state's ideological coherence. The sedition and conspiracy charges functioned as flexible categories, tools that did not necessarily require proof of action, but were decisive nonetheless. Instead, they relied on associations, shared ideas, and mere proximity to radical spaces in order to convict. In the case of Wobblies, prosecutors could convict based solely on shared intent, even if no defendant had taken any specific action. The Hindu-German conspiracy trial in 1917 invoked a vague wartime neutrality violation to frame Ghadir as a foreign threat, effectively rendering anti-colonialism itself illegal. Likewise, sedition charges were widely applied to Wobblies for their aversion to American involvement in World War I. The power of these charges, I argue, was in their capaciousness. Conspiracy could mean anything from political speech to transnational organizing, and sedition became shorthand for any critique of war, empire, or capital. For Asian American history, the category of the public charge, for instance, also became a placeholder for racial and political undesirability under the rubric of the law. Further, I show how these charges were used spectacularly and tactically in federal courts, municipal ordinances, and immigration hearings. Vagrancy laws, for instance, were repurposed to criminalize labor refusal. County officials openly admitted to prosecuting Wobbly members simply for refusing to work. So what emerges here between the Wobblies and the Ghadir party is a carceral continuum, a system in which legal ambiguity was not an aberration, but rather a feature shared among two victims. It allowed the state to act exceptionally, swiftly, and repress broadly, all within the language of law and order. These spectacular trials and repressions of Ghadirites and Wobblies also stirred liberal discomfort. In the archive, I found petitions in which groups like the International Associations of Machinists and the Philadelphia chapter of Young Democracy, who we may refer to here as labor nationalists, protested the deportation of those Ghadirites convicted in the conspiracy trials from San Francisco. These petitions were not perfect. They hinged on belief in a redeemable American project, and this would become a point of fracture between petitioners and the Ghadirites alike. Hardayal, for instance, linked capital and imperial expansion, and therefore rejected labor nationalism. Dayal's mode of thought, too, which mirrored the internationalist thinking of the Wobblies, therefore starkly contrasted with labor nationalists' inability to locate race and labor within an international economic and colonial structure. Still, I argue that these protesters nonetheless participated in a wider refusal of the state's spectacular performances of anti-Gother discipline. If, as Lauren Verlant theorizes, publics are not only relational or rational collectives formed through formal political consensus, but affective spaces in which people recognize themselves as bound by a shared response to crisis or a shared vulnerability, then perhaps I argue these petitions forge community and move towards de-interpolating even liberal subjects away from the nation state's imperial project. By many metrics, 1917 trials marked the end of the Gother Party and the decline of the Wobblies as well. Capitalist and imperialist regimes won. The 1917 Hindu-German conspiracy trial and the mass indictments of Wobblies marked the state's decisive triumph over radical threat. Surveillance succeeded, trials concluded, and deportations commenced. And as later periods of the Red Scares would suggest for many observers and institutions, the events of 1917 would mark an era of ideological containment vis-a-vis political radicalism and insurgent bodies. Yet I ask, if Gotherite and Wobbly ideologies demand of us to ignore the rigid and constraining boundaries that are so intrinsic to the national and colonial form, I wonder then if there is a way to look beyond these forms to see the persistence of these radical groups. Perhaps the most unexpected terrain for solidarity that I found in this chapter was in the prison. As Christina Heatherton writes about the prison yard, Wobblies, Gotherites, socialists, Black radicals, Irish Republicans, and other, quote, undesirables after these trials soon became prison inmates in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. It would be at Leavenworth that Wobblies, Gotherites, and Mexican anarchists continued working as co-conspirators in what was called a University of Radicalism. Prisoners here created a radical library. They held philosophy and language classes in the prison yard, which they called the campus. These practices transformed the prison into a pedagogical space, repurposing carceral infrastructure into one of counter-intimacy. Radical relation, even in confinement, endured. In keeping with the language of the university then, these radical insurgent figures turned the prison into a radical site, an infrastructure of study, world-making, and collective refusal, built in the shadows of imperial violence, which exceeded not only prison walls, but the border itself. A prison library quickly filled with anarchist and socialist periodicals. I argue that these pedagogical acts were not symbolic gestures, but instead they were practices of political counter-intimacy, continuations of insurgent lifeways under new, strict spatial constraints. Thus, it was within the very walls meant to contain them that these organizers sustained and extended transnational revolutionary solidarity. And in so doing, it reveals what I argued throughout the thesis, which is that refusal and solidarity do not in fact require permission from the state, but rather transcend the bordered form and require only proximity, pedagogy, and imagination to function. And so I end this thesis arguing that Gotherites and Wobblies shared a grammar, a way of thinking and organizing that challenged the bordered logics of empire and capital. As such, they leave us not just a record of what was resisted, but rather an open archive and a blueprint for what might be built otherwise. In their print cultures, their shared prison, and their persistent pedagogies, we find an infrastructure of anti-colonialism that flowed freely in and out of the state. And perhaps most critically, it flowed via the imagination. If this thesis offers a framework for understanding imagination under empire's shadow, then I want to end by asking what that framework might mean for our present. In tracing Gother's insurgent world-making practices, their solidarities with labor radicals, their refusal of colonial borders, and their pedagogies behind prison walls, I've come to see imagination not as excess, but as threat. Gother imagined otherwise, and empire responded with repression. The Gotherite Ramchandra once asked, "Why is the British government so afraid of our purely ethical and educational work?" That question, posed more than a century ago, continues to echo today. Why is it that when radical actors imagine outside the sanctioned political frame, it is imagination itself that becomes dangerous and policed? We see this today. On campuses across the US, including here at Tufts, we're witnessing a violent return of the state's disciplinary infrastructure. Migrant scholars and student organizers who speak in solidarity with Palestinians are surveilled, detained, and disappeared. The DHS now asks universities to report on students engaging in, quote, dangerous thinking. All of this too under the guise of national security. What is feared, however, I argue, is not just critique, it is imagination. The kind of imagination that sees Gaza, for instance, as proximate, that refuses to disaggregate liberation struggles, that envisions a world not ordered by empire, but rather entangled by care. And increasingly, that fear is enforced not by separate ideological and repressive state apparatuses, but rather by their collapse into one. The university, once imagined as a space of inquiry, becomes an extension of the carceral state. As with Gaza, the most radical work today reimagines. It reconfigures relation, risk, and solidarity. And that imaginative work, I argue, is what empire has always feared most. So I turn finally to this quote from Hardayal, which have guided me throughout this project. He says to a fellow young rationalist in his Hints for Self-Culture, "You stand between the past and the future. The world is yours to enjoy, to organize, and to reconstruct." Goddard teaches us that imagination is not neutral. It is a method, a weapon, and a responsibility. And in moments like ours, it may be the first thing empire tries to contain, because it's the first thing that reminds us the world does not have to stay as it is, and it is in fact ours to reconstruct. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikhil. It is such really deeply moving work. Thank you so much. Professor Sato, do you have a question you want to launch, and then we'll move?
Sure. Yeah, I can start off. Thank you so much, Nikhil. I mean, what a beautiful and powerful thesis. I was reading it over the course of the past week, and I just kept having to stop because it was so, I think the linkages that you're tracing between the contemporary moment and then the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, is just, it was just such a powerful way to kind of, trace those genealogies that are in place. I wanted to ask you to speak a little bit about, as I was reading the thesis, one thing that really struck me was kind of how you are thinking at different scales throughout the thesis. And I think that's something that is a really big strength of yours, where you're able to kind of look at things very zoomed out and really see, from the level of infrastructure. If you think about infrastructure, it's kind of at, the level of the system. But then at the same time, there are other moments like, you ended on this very intimate kind of reading of, this reflection where, he's writing to this other, who was he writing to?
A fellow
Right?
young rationalist.
Okay,
Yeah.
But it's
That's
like
literally
this
what it
moment
was.
of, it's a very intimate, it's very different than kind of the opening letter that you begin with, Lansing's letter, So throughout, as I was reading it, there were all these vacillations of scale, and I just kept thinking, how do you kind of put into conversation this idea of the intimate, or Lisa Lowe's intimacies, with this idea of infrastructure? I mean, I think that there's something really generative there in that tension. And so I was just going to ask you to speak a little bit more about that, how it informed both your archival practice, your analytical thinking, but just how are you thinking about, intimacy and infrastructures collectively together?
I think scale was a very big challenge throughout the thesis because, there's just so much here. I will say, for context, Professor Sato was referring briefly to a letter that I close read in the first chapter from the then Secretary of State to the then Secretary of Labor, and he was asking to curb immigration. And in that chapter, I think there's a real tension in scale there alone, where you have this letter, right, between two people. It's very casual, it's very nonchalant. I kind of do a close reading of tone there as well. And so at play, even within that letter, you have this broad and very large infrastructure between two empires, and simultaneously, in the form of a letter, it is an intimate kind of engagement. So I think that starting with that letter in the archive ended up establishing and circumscribing the scale for me of the thesis, because you have at once these very domineering structures, these systems at play, and simultaneously in the archive, what you witness is that those very, very big structures are composed of small intimate nodes between people. I think that in terms of really zooming in, I really enjoyed zooming in the second chapter, because I think that in the second chapter, I look specifically at Are They All and not the Goddard Party in aggregate. And I found it really generative to zoom in there. Just because I think that he was a fascinating figure who, frankly speaking, deserves his own thesis. And B, I think that there was just something about the way that he was so intimate with his readers, with his comrades, and of course, with this fellow rationalist here who is unnamed, but yeah.
Thank you.
Can we, Matt? Can we stay with this for a second?
Yeah.
So right, the moment when the Goddard Party's coming together is also a moment of in the US of consolidating and enforcing white supremacy, the rise of anti-Asian laws. And I think that one of the things that's happening sort of bicoastally, or sort of a distinction between the East Coast and the West Coast in the sort of organizing of Indian anti-colonial activists, is that it's more active, it's more intellectuals on the East Coast, and on the West Coast where they all lands, the movement is largely comprised of immigrant workers, right? Who are motivated by their experience of profound racial discrimination and violence. So I wondered if you link in really deep ways racial hierarchies, Western imperialism, and capitalist expansion. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the racial hierarchies for a moment. And I'm interested here in this, it's so interesting how it sort of embeds it in this whole statement, but this idea that life is a racial heritage.
Yeah.
So I have, so
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah.
It's an unwieldy large question, but if there's some point of contact in there, you can help us think a little bit about how these terms are working together, and in particular, if you could draw out the piece about race in relationship to empire.
I think I don't attend very closely to it in my thesis, but what did emerge to me in terms of that through like writing and research is that Dayal was certainly very cognizant of race, but I think he saw race as specifically a construct born out of empire and born out of capitalism. And that certainly emerges in his kinships. When he was at Oxford, he would travel far and wide. He would like visit like Russian radicals and various anarchists, and then I think at one point visited Sun Yat-sen in Hawaii. Or he had been around.
Promiscuous, right?
Yeah, promiscuous, politically promiscuous. Radical action, promiscuity.
Most positive, yeah, most positive, yeah.
I think that really informed it. I will say that at times in his writing, it felt almost like he was completely bracketing off race. And that was fascinating to me. I'm not sure in exact terms, I can't say precisely how it is that he felt about that, but what I'm gonna extrapolate here on saying is that if we're looking at his kind of utopian vision in the world state as one that is non-territorial, that is unbordered, that sees kind of neighbor or anyone else as brother, that I think complicates or maybe problematizes the idea of race in an interesting way, insofar as it almost renders it moot. Certainly, as emerges in his speeches and works with the Wobblies, he is talking a lot about anti-Black repressions in the US. And so in that sense, he is cognizant of like race in America.
Yes.
But I think he doesn't necessarily attend to it very closely in what I've read.
I mean, what you just did is really elegant, right? Which is to say that he subordinated it. For righteous reasons, and deliberate reasons, right? That he subordinated the question to capitalism. It takes it as a myth that's circulating a construction. But then I was so surprised.
Racial heritage. Also, there's like Lucretius.
I don't know if it. Yeah. Do you have a reading of why it surfaces here, or?
I honestly did not read into that part so closely, and so I don't have an answer at the top of my head. I will say that something that came to me, it doesn't necessarily attend to the racial heritage part, but I was thinking more as you were speaking about kind of transposing the rubric of caste into this
Yes.
in an interesting way. Dayal was an upper caste Indian. He was, fairly of high stature in India, like familially. He got a place at Oxford, and the reason why he decided to forfeit the scholarship or leave the area was because he didn't want to be under British subjectivity. That his education, that his work would all be in service of and under the kind of gaze and control of the British Empire. I think that maybe started in my mind, sort of the path towards constructing race elsewhere.
Yes, yes.
But again, these are not full-fledged thoughts.
Well, no, it's beautiful. Do you have another question you want to try?
Okay, all right.
You know,
Yes, I do.
I have pages and pages that probably.
Yeah, I know, I'm just like,
how
how do I mean, there's just so much to say. Okay, I want to ask you a little bit about chapter 2
Mhm.
and, I mean, I guess you can give the audience like just a little bit of a summary of it. But just because, it treats this idea of fugitive mobility, and, you're taking the course on
Mobility
mobility
sphere.
with me, so I just wanted to hear more about how you're thinking about mobility, not just in chapter 2 with Dayal, but then other moments where you saw,
Yeah.
where you're thinking about mobility and how it can be a mode of resistance, or in other cases, like with vagrancy laws or with public charges where mobility was seen as this kind of an act of dissident.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I would start here by talking about where the anti-mobile impulse comes from, which is, I think the way that I'm kind of seeing it throughout the thesis is that the bordered form, either in the colony or the nation state, really demands protection of the border. And that means protection of, what enters, what egresses, including bodies, ideas, goods. And that becomes like a really important site of both control and dominance within those forms. And so I identify in chapter 2 specifically, for context, Hardayal is arrested. He then leaves the country, flows back in, flows back out. He is moving through borders, left and right. I call them slippages. And that to me, I think is fascinating because the nation state as a project, for instance, insists on the naturalization of the border, right? That the border is not an arbitrary political formation, but rather something intrinsic to land, when in reality it's just not. And so these moments of kind of unfettered mobility in an embodied sense, which I tend to in the second chapter, become refusals of that naturalization. They kind of disrupt the naturalizing process there. What I also tend to, I think, maybe in that chapter, but also across the thesis, is the idea of epistemic mobility.
Yes.
And I think that right now we live in a world that's hypermobile and ideas are shared, all the time in manifold forms. At the time, however, there was a much stricter control of postage or surveillance in that way, because like the modes of communication that way were very different.
Right.
And what I note in chapter 2, but also a bit in chapter 3, is that the transmission of ideas between both members interpersonally in an intimate way, but also through publications, which kind of were hidden in hand baggage, were kind of carried on ships, and therefore, in fact, inverted or subverted the imperial infrastructure. Also became ways of challenging that, which I thought was fascinating. About hints for self-culture, a fun note that I add in the second chapter is that this was another moment of refusal in a really interesting way in which epistemic mobility became a bit of a critique. So Hardayal publishes this from the US, I believe. Actually, I think he was in Philly at the time. And he tried to have it published and circulated in India, but he thought it was going to happen. He thought the British Crown's office would not let it be published, but its illegibility and kind of refusal to identify with what was seen as political at the time by Britain is what actually let this text be circulated in India. The Crown saw it not as a political text, but as a philosophical one, and therefore it was safe. And so that again becomes this mode in which the mobility of ideas is like
Yeah.
really interesting side of critique, I think.
I think drawing out kind of what you're saying about the imperial infrastructures, like the British postal system, for example. And then, you briefly talked a little bit about the distribution or dissemination of Gotterite propaganda. And a lot of them, where they were using the kind of the British steamship routes where they would come on the ships and then like disseminate all the propaganda, then get off. Like they weren't actually taking, these routes, but they were putting the propaganda on. And then, so I think, I mean, I hope that this project continues to develop, but that might be one thing to continue to draw as kind of like this tension between the imperial infrastructures, but then also these other like embodied infrastructures or embodied fugitive mobilities that you're tracing. But just wonder.
It strikes me again, just the ease with which you say something like, of course, the naturalization of borders demands the policing of bodies, ideas, and goods. And you just, it's really remarkable, right? Because it takes such, I mean, you have to really have so deeply entered something to be able to formulate things with that kind of elegance and precision. So thank you. I have a lot of questions. The move that you're making towards our contemporary moment and the language of dangerous thinking. And you do something really extraordinary with the tension between the sort of total misapprehension on the part of the state about the threat and the total recognition of the actual threat of dangerous radical thinking, right? So you do something really beautiful with that. And I want to hear more about the blueprint for otherwise, but I also want to stop talking. I thought maybe we could open it to the floor and then I will give you more questions. I wonder if people here in the room or on Zoom might have questions.
It was noted in the chat, but if anyone on Zoom has a question, just send it as a chat and I have the chat open.
So thinking about the solidarity within the prisons and within some of these these different groups, do you think in your readings, was it inevitable that this was happening? Or like, were there moments where the solidarity broke down or didn't happen? And like, what was the, I don't know, because it seemed like it's a little bit inevitable, I guess, but were there moments where there?
I didn't read necessarily far enough into the textured history within the prison to know if there were kind of moments where it faltered or where, there were tensions, although I'm sure there were in all coalitional politics there are. There just has to be. But I do think the word inevitability is interesting here because I think that the solidarity was inevitable, right? I think that also the rendering of the carceral infrastructure as a radical one was also inevitable. If, as I argue in the thesis, these insurgent actors are writ large refusing to abide by the logics of the border or the nation state or the empire, why would they abide by the logics of the prison too? And so I think that there is that inevitability that kind of takes place where, you put them in a prison, you put them together. I don't know, something happened recently too. They put all the Jan 6 people in the same prison and they also got radicalized. It just happens. But it became a space there of pedagogy, and I don't know about the tensions, but the answer is probably.
And then one follow-up. Do you think this is more like a top-down coming from the leaders being like communicating and talking with one another, or more like a bottom up with some of the people in the just bigger group sort of coalescing and
within the insurgent groups?
Yeah.
Ethically, both groups really were not necessarily very hierarchical. The Gother Party especially. I know there was a bit more in the Wobblies, and again, I don't have a very, very rich history there. But in the Gother Party, it was very relational, and it was very, it didn't necessarily be like a top-down or a bottom-up thing. It was just kind of level.
Just to follow on Professor Sato's opening question, I would like to hear a little more about, because infrastructure is a really interesting idiom to use, and there's a lot of other ones that are out there like assemblage or network and even this idea of intimacies. And we think of intimacies as kind of somehow anti-structural in some ways. So I really like what you're doing with infrastructure. And I think the question about the prison suggests how, in terms of, I'm reading your argument, right, they're taking advantage of actually the structures of the prisons to achieve this kind of new form of intimacy, using the prison yard as a campus or whatever. But but is there an anti-structural element to all of this too? Is it
Yeah.
a kind of, is there a different way to imagine some of these networks or connectivities that don't just play right onto or map according to the imperial or nationalistic frameworks?
Yeah, that's a great question. AB and I have been talking about that tension for the past week or two. And
Sorry.
no, it's an important one. I had for a second some apprehension about calling it an infrastructure, because I think that insofar as these groups were anti-statist, very much non-territorial in nature, they may not necessarily love the term infrastructure to describe them. And ironically, neither do the British or Americans. So they like to hide that too. But I think that I'm using infrastructure, I guess, in two ways. There are like the rigid infrastructures, right, which is the publication of materials that are being transported. You mentioned the subversion of the prison. The steamship was also subverted. And in that way, the infrastructure becomes an important site. But I also think that there is something to be said about intimacy forming a chain or a bridge itself, and that being seen as infrastructure too. That infrastructures cannot just be constructed in a bridge or an actual construct, but rather can be formed through relation. And that's what I'm trying to get at in the thesis, that though they were non-structural in many senses, and insofar as they were kind of the anti-infrastructure. I still identify as kind of this intimate counter infrastructure in the thesis.
If I can just follow up, I mean, just on terms of this quote, then it seems like there's a kind of epistemological infrastructure. to
Yes,
it, ethical
absolutely.
infrastructure, right? Which is drawing on Stoicism and Western liberal construction of the self. So
Yes.
he hasn't actually extricated himself even from that liberal process of
Yeah,
self-discipline, self-care
Yeah.
totally.
for the self, all of that. And my reading of this racial heritage, it's just, you brought up caste, so just, if you think of Jati,
Mhm.
like an endogamous caste group, but Jati can also mean race or
Yeah,
totality. So
Yeah.
you may be thinking of a Manav Jati or the human race of this heritage might be kind of humanistic one in his imagination or something.
it's
right?
beautiful.
Yeah, yeah, but that's really generative. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, great work.
Other questions here?
I was wondering, there was a lot of discussion about the parallels that you're drawing to current events in Gaza specifically,
Mhm.
but I didn't feel like you really got the chance to describe those to us. And so I was wondering if you could share a little bit about the conclusions or like the feelings that came up while writing this thesis in the current political climate.
Yeah, I mean, I started this thesis I started thinking about it 2 years ago, and things were very different then. I mean, certainly the occupation still was still happening in Palestine. But we've seen a rampant acceleration of that since October 2023, summer after, or the fall after the start of this inquiry. I see a lot of continuities. I think that there are continuities on either side, right? On the side of like the maybe imperial infrastructure, we're seeing now a very intimate relation between the US and Israel, for instance, in which you have this sharing of arms and diplomatic warfare. Yes, but also the policing of pro-Palestine thinking and activism within the state's borders. And so I think that's a continuity there. In chapter 1, I identify that conspiracy became this discursive technology that was used to frame these anti-colonial actors as external to the nation, this politics of enmity that kind of let it continue. And likewise, now we see the idea of the terrorist sympathizer or the idea of the terrorist itself. So there's a great parallel there too. And again, I think that the thing that has really been keeping me both going and thinking in terms of the continuities between then and now is that the Gothic Party was notably made up largely of scholar activists, migrant scholar activists. And we are seeing very tragically migrant scholar activists today being faced with the same treatment, the same repression as was experienced then. And I think that continuity, I'm cautious of kind of exposing because I don't want to present them as identical at all, and they're very different stories. But certainly some of the frameworks, tactics, and themes reappear, and that's, I think, been something to stick with as I've been writing.
Other questions?
Or comments.
I was very excited to see you engaging with The Intimacies of Four Continents by Lisa Lowe, and I feel like that's a very important work in RCD that's come out in multiple classes. I was wondering if there are any other contemporary just pieces of writing or scholars that you engaged with more in your thesis.
Yeah, contemporary scholars. I will say that the two books that were probably most cited in this thesis were Lisa Lowe's Intimacies, of course, and also Seema Sohi's Echoes of Mutiny. Sohi does this phenomenal and expansive really research on the Gother Party, and specifically frames the US collaboration with Britain in this time as a kind of political turn that policed and tried to kind of abolish radicalism. And that was just a great text. In terms of theory, a few people kind of keep coming up. Professor Bong comes up a lot, which is great, and that's a really lovely feeling. Professor Hatcher shows up a few times. That's true.
Showed up.
Dropped in.
Yeah, I just dropped in, like, hello.
But
Invited.
not, I guess contemporary necropolitics comes up a lot by Mbembe, and thinking about enmity or thinking about those things. Not so much contemporary, but Althusser is certainly there. Yeah, I'm blanking, but those are the ones that come to mind.
This is a process question, but what surprised you the most and what you enjoyed about the process of writing this? And then also maybe after, how does this process or this whole experience inform what you are hoping to dive into deeper going forward, or if it shaped something in you that you want to share with us?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Sophia. Surprises, a lot changed. I submitted a second chapter, which is the first chapter I'd written, in December to AB, and let me tell you, the current thesis looks nothing like it. I turned that second chapter into the first and the second and bits of the third. I did major surgery on that. The scale of the thesis changed quite a bit in terms of what it was that I was zooming in on, what I was zooming out on. And that was both challenging and really exciting. I think that also the biggest challenge or surprise was that as college students, you don't really think in chapters, you think in single papers. And so having to not only think synthetically within the chapter, but rather as a broader body of work was very challenging and very exciting throughout the process. There were moments where I was like, what do I say in chapter 1 and how do I make that work in chapter 3, vice versa? So that kind of recursive process was something that was very new to me and something I hadn't yet done, and that was very exciting. In terms of what I would like to maybe turn to next, there are moments in this thesis that I found kind of puzzling and that I have had a difficult time reconciling with. Chiefly in chapter 2, I identify a moment in which Hardayal thinks of the US as this kind of perfect site from which to organize. There's this kind of view of the US as being one that is disentangled with Britain, at least spatially. And in so doing, it almost feels like he is presenting the US itself as an anti-colonial project, which it of course is not. And so I was thinking about moments like that and similar moments in the thesis that emerge as kind of an interesting site of inquiry for a future project where I would like to look at kind of how the US was in fact doomed from the start. I mean, certainly there's the settler capitalist project that made the United States happen and actively makes the US happen. But I also think it's interesting to think about the US within post-colonial theory, as fraught as that may be, because maybe there was a chance after Britain left, for instance, to do something different. Maybe we didn't have to import writ large the Western epistemology or the logics of Enlightenment or the literal aesthetics, the acid washing of Ivy League campuses to look like Oxbridge. And so thinking aesthetically and logically and philosophically there, I do wonder was they all onto something potentially? Was this delusion maybe rooted in something optimistic? And that's something I would like to maybe look at later, but yeah, I don't know, the thesis was full of surprises and it's done.
Not really a question. I thought about reading out some of your texts that you sent me through the process. of
Oh, no.
writing the thesis. I think everyone would enjoy that, but I'm gonna save you the embarrassment. I just wanted to say that me and all of your other friends are so proud of you. And it's been so much fun to see the process of your work and everything that developed up to it and talking with you about all the things and then hearing you say, I just got off the phone with Lisa Lowe. Yeah, we're all so proud of you.
I'm so glad to have friends here. I was thinking about this earlier. I mean, there's like this kind of like image of like the, I don't know, academic is like isolated in some weird tower, like philosophizing in a very solipsistic way. And RCD has been anything but that. I think that this is a place and a space in which scholarship is seen as like intrinsically communal and relational. And I don't know, it's just really nice to have my friends here and have my professors here. And I don't know, it feels amazing.
Can I just point though to how deliberately you theorize that and then work on it as a material practice in your prose in terms of your habits of acknowledgement, citation, the way you keep opening the door to new ideas, the sort of insistence and reading comparatively in relation about that sort of movement, because it would be easy to end up with a sort of narrow intellectual history, but what you insist on again and again is about the ways that there are movements towards solidarity and those sort of opening, and that is, I hope there's something like an intellectual atmosphere that supports that. But fundamentally, when you're sitting there with the page, you are making that move, and it is really extraordinary, and you do it with an extraordinary finesse. Thank you. What did you? Yes,
Yeah.
please.
So I'm not going to talk like him, I'll try. As a mother, as a parent, for sure, we learned a lot from him during the process also. This is aha moment for us. Even though I came from India, I did not know that US played a role. So I think 2 occasions, Nikhil kind of taught me especially, right? Why standing up is important. And also this is a learning moment for us, for me and for my husband. And it's kind of, I want to say proud of you.
Love you both.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.
Please.
I have a question, not.
Yeah. You're not wrong. Speak for yourself.
I know, right? Enough of that happened.
My question comes, if I may. This question comes from this quote itself, right? So I know a little bit about Ghazal Party before you started it, because there was a big revolutionary Bhagat Singh,
Absolutely,
revered. He came from the same ideology. My question about Hardayal is, what exactly from this quote he sees as a global person? You can see him as a global person. Then there was some good in colonialism, right? There was no India. The nationalism happened because of colonial forces.
Sure.
So what exactly Hardayal's ideology against colonialism? Is it capitalism? Is it the oppression of particular race? What exactly he is fighting?
Yeah.
So what is his main motive?
Sure. I think that one thing that I identify in the second chapter is that it wasn't necessarily solely a negation of the nation state or of the colony. I mean, he certainly was identifying ails in that system, but he was really thinking very affirmatively about what it is that he wanted. And I think that first of all, I think alongside Gandhi's like Hind Swaraj and also this text, what kind of emerges as a parallel here is seeing capitalism, imperialism, colonialism as despite being rooted in this, again, Western idea of liberal freedom, was anything but free, right? It was an imposition of logics, an imposition of a lifestyle. It was an imposition of labor that really impeded freedom in a very violent way. And so what he was thinking about, both spiritually and politically, was how it was that we would achieve that freedom. And so he imagined, again, the world state, which is again not territorial in its basis. It's not ordered, but rather kind of sees as its basis ethical relation. So you can think about it as this like almost communalistic mode of thinking. Certainly he was also a communist, so there's that. But if that helps. But I think that generally what he was seeing was capitalism or the colony as being things that were really restraining and repressing the scope for intimacy or kinship or relation or ethical life. And so in that place, he proposes turning to those modes that are again being contained as sites of freedom.
Thank you.
It's hard not to want to just pause there. Thank you all so much. And Nikhil, if we might offer some congratulations and gratitude for the work you've done.
You did it.
You did it.
Really, Nikhil.
Bravo.
So-
I want to take a photo of you and your parents.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Sorry, I'm like,
No,
I'm like the mom.
Yeah.
trying to take
Yeah.
photos.
No, 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 no.
For our like end of